"Listen to this," said Evelyn Harrow, tapping the crisp pages of the newspaper with a manicured finger. She read aloud, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Lord and Lady Blackwood are hosting an exclusive gathering at Ravenhurst Manor this week. Among the notable guests are Miss Evelyn Harrow, Mr. Julian March, Dr. Peter Wren, Colonel Hardwicke, and the esteemed Mr. Felix Graves." She tossed the paper aside with a dramatic sigh. "Well, at least we know what we're walking into, though I dare say they've already made a mess of it." Her companion, the ever-observant Mr. Graves, arched a brow. It was often remarked that wherever he was found, intrigue was sure to follow. Some claimed it was due to his unquenchable thirst for society's dramas, while others whispered that he had a knack for uncovering secrets best left buried. Evelyn, a woman of striking presence, smirked as she adjusted the pearl buttons on her glove. "Oh, don't play coy, Felix. You know exactly what I mean, and if I had to wager, I'd say you're here because you suspect things are about to take a rather dramatic turn." Mr. Graves merely chuckled. "I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about." "Come now," she pressed, her eyes gleaming. "I'm talking about Julian March. Surely you don't expect me to believe you've never heard of him?" "Ah," Graves mused, tilting his head. "The renowned explorer, big game hunts, lost cities. He's a rather romantic figure, isn't he?" "Romantic?" Evelyn gave a short laugh. "More like dangerous. The Blackwoods were eager to have him, of course. And his wife, a charming little thing, really, barely 20, while he must be pushing 50. Sweet, naive, and utterly unaware of the storm she's walked into." Graves steepled his fingers. "You sound as if you pity her." Evelyn's expression darkened. "Let's just say I wouldn't want to be in her shoes tonight." There was a pause, thick with unspoken tension. Evelyn continued, her voice lower now, as if the walls had ears. "Hardwicke's another one, a dull sort really, one of those brooding military men with too many medals and too few words. He and March have history. They were on that expedition together." Graves' gaze sharpened. "Which expedition?" Evelyn hesitated, then leaned in. "You know which one. The Blackwood expedition, the one that ended in scandal. And then there's Dr. Wren, always in the shadows, always listening. What do you suppose he knows?" Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Outside, the wind howled against the great stone walls of Ravenhurst, rattling the glass. Somewhere in the depths of the manor, a clock chimed. The night stretched ahead, full of secrets, full of danger, and before it was over, blood would be spilled. "And what I've endured, no one truly knows," Eleanor Fairchild muttered, her gloved fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. "One must be constantly at their elbow. Not that way. You mustn't do this. Honestly, I thank my stars I'm done with it. Not that we've had a falling out. Oh heavens no. I never quarrel, but someone else can take up the burden now. As I always say, I can tolerate arrogance, but I will not abide deception." She exhaled sharply, her jeweled bracelet glinting in the candlelight. Across from her, Felix Greaves studied her with quiet amusement. It was well known that where Greaves went, intrigue followed. He had an eye for secrets, an ear for whispered betrayals, and a taste for the unfolding dramas of high society. "If I were still managing the guest list," Eleanor continued, her voice dripping with irony, "I would have put my foot down. You cannot invite Isabel Harcourt with the Lennoxes. It's simply not done." She paused dramatically, letting the words settle like an ominous fog. "But were they really once involved?" Greaves asked, tilting his head. "My dear man," Eleanor scoffed, "it's practically written in the annals of scandal. That fateful expedition to the Congo. I'm astonished the woman had the audacity to accept the invitation." "Perhaps she wasn't aware the Lennoxes would be here," Greaves suggested. "Or perhaps she was," Eleanor countered, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. "She's precisely the sort of woman who would revel in such a confrontation. Mark my words, she's dangerous, the kind who never forgets a slight, and never forgives an injury. I wouldn't be in Robert Lennox's shoes this weekend for all the diamonds in Paris." Greaves gave a nonchalant shrug, and his wife, blissfully unaware I presume, as innocent as a lamb at slaughter, Eleanor said almost pityingly, "Of course. Someone will eventually take it upon themselves to enlighten her. These things have a way of unraveling on their own. A shadow fell across them as Charles Everett strolled up, his golden hair catching the light. He dropped onto the garden bench with a weary sigh. Thank God someone wants my company. The Lennoxes are playing the devoted couple, Henry's engrossed in the newspaper, and I was this close to being cornered by our hostess. He laughed, flashing teeth as white as ivory. Eleanor joined in, though her eyes flicked to Greaves, who remained somber, detached, ever the observer. Poor Charles, she teased, duty-bound to endure the tedium of country weekends. I suppose you've already been subjected to the infamous ghost story, the Fairchild ghost. Charles rolled his eyes. Please tell me they've spared you from it. Not a Fairchild ghost, Greaves interjected. A Ravenscourt Manor ghost. The house came with it. Eleanor tapped a finger against her glass. Ah yes, I recall now, but it doesn't rattle chains, does it? It's something about a window. Charles stopped mid-sip. A window. Before anyone could respond, Greaves' gaze drifted past him, fixing on three figures making their way down the garden path, a striking woman flanked by two men. At first glance, the men appeared similar, both tall and broad-shouldered, their sun-kissed faces bearing the hardened look of men accustomed to danger, but upon closer inspection, the differences emerged. One of them, Robert Lennox, carried an aura of undeniable intensity, a magnetism that turned heads and commanded attention. Greaves exhaled slowly. The night was thick with tension, the air laced with something unspoken, something inevitable. The pieces were set, the players in position. Before the weekend was through, someone would not leave Ravenscourt Manor alive. There was something about Robert Lennox that made people take notice. His presence was like a flickering flame, commanding, impossible to ignore. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. Beside him, his old friend John Mercer walked with quiet resolve. Mercer had always been content in the background, a man of solid build with calculating grey eyes that missed nothing. He had the air of a man who had spent years standing just outside the light, observing but never stepping forward. Between them walked Evelyn Lennox, a vision of delicate beauty. Her copper-red hair caught the dying sunlight, forming a halo around her face, her wide hazel eyes brimming with an innocence that felt almost fragile. She had been Evelyn Carter only 3 months ago, swept off her feet into a world she barely understood. From his spot beneath the grand oak, Felix Greaves studied them keenly. He was not a man to believe in fate, but watching Evelyn between these two men, her husband and the man who had stood by his side for years, he felt a strange unease coil in his chest. That girl must not be hurt, he murmured under his breath. It would be monstrous for her to be caught in this. Lady Eleanor's parasol twitched as she waved at the approaching trio. Sit down, dears, and don't interrupt, she commanded. Felix was just about to tell us a ghost story. I do love ghost stories, Evelyn said eagerly, sinking into the cool grass, her gaze bright with curiosity. The legend of Ravenscourt Manor. Robert's voice was measured, but there was something guarded in his expression. Felix raised an eyebrow. You've heard of it? Robert nodded. I used to stay here as a boy, before the Warringtons lost the estate. The Watching Stranger, isn't that what they called it? The Watching Stranger, Evelyn echoed, tilting her head. How intriguing. Please go on. Felix hesitated, but the anticipation in their eyes left him little choice. He exhaled. It's an old tale, he began. The story goes that centuries ago, the master of this house had a wife who loved another. One stormy night, she and her lover murdered him in his own chamber, and fled into the darkness. But as they reached the edge of the estate, they turned back, and there, in the upper window, they saw his face staring after them, a dead man watching. Evelyn shivered. That's horrible. The legend is only part of it, Felix continued, his voice lowering slightly. The real mystery is the window. The very room where the murder took place. There's a single pane of glass, untouched for generations, where an irregular stain remains. From up close, it's almost invisible, but from a distance, it forms the distinct shape of a man's face. Forever looking out, a hush fell over them. Evelyn lifted her gaze to the looming manor. Which window is it? You can't see it from here, Felix said, his voice almost reluctant. It's around the other side. Something in his tone made Robert glance at him sharply. Mercer, silent until now, shifted slightly, as though weighing some unspoken thought. The evening air grew heavier, as though the house itself was listening. Somewhere within the shadows of Ravenscourt Manor, something waited, and by the time the weekend was over, the legend of the watching stranger would not be the only ghost that haunted this house. The last rays of the sun cast long twisting shadows across the grounds of Ravenscourt Manor, as the conversation turned once more to the legend that refused to die. Evelyn Lennox shivered slightly, though the air was warm. The boarded-up window, unseen but ever present, seemed to exert a peculiar weight on the gathering. It was sealed off from the inside. Felix Greaves murmured, his voice measured, but distant. 40 years ago, if I recall correctly, as up repoued Ford Ford. Robert Lennox, seated beside his wife, frowned. And why was that? Felix hesitated, choosing his words carefully. No one ever saw an apparition, he admitted. But superstition grows like ivy on old stone. And after what happened in that room, well, some things are best left undisturbed. There was a silence, taut and heavy, before John Mercer, ever the pragmatist, leaned back with a scoff. More likely, someone wanted to put an end to the rumors once and for all. You seal off the window, you kill the story. Felix did not reply, but the glint in his eye suggested he was not so sure. Sensing the tension, Jimmy Ullinson, ever the entertainer, took up the thread of a new topic. I knew a man in Egypt who swore by the sand diviners, he said casually, claimed they could read the past as easily as footprints in the dunes. Frauds, most of them. Mercer muttered, eager to tell you what has been but never what will be. It's illegal to predict the future here, isn't it? Robert mused. Evelyn had a gypsy try to read her fortune, but the woman gave back the money and refused. Perhaps she saw something she didn't want to say, Evelyn suggested with a half-smile, though something flickered in her expression, something uncertain. Don't be dramatic, Jimmy said lightly. I refuse to believe you're marked by fate. Felix watched her closely. I wonder, he thought. I truly wonder. His musings were interrupted by movement from the house. Two figures approached, a short, formidable-looking woman draped in jade green, and beside her, a vision of cool elegance in cream. The contrast between them was striking. Mrs. Unkerton beamed. Everyone, I do believe we all know each other. Here's Mrs. Staverton. Lady Eleanor murmured dryly. These people have a gift for saying precisely the wrong thing. But Felix was not listening. His gaze was fixed on Mrs. Staverton. She carried herself with effortless grace, her greeting smooth, natural, almost too much so. Robert, it's been ages. Sorry I couldn't make the wedding, and this must be your wife. You must be quite tired of meeting all of your husband's weather-beaten friends. Evelyn smiled, polite, reserved, but Mrs. Staverton's gaze lingered a fraction too long, as if measuring something unseen, and then with a shift so subtle it was almost imperceptible, she turned to Mercer. Hello, John. The tone was different now, not just casual recognition, but warmth, familiarity, a thread of something unspoken wove between them, a connection that had been there long before tonight. Felix saw it, and from the way Robert's jaw tightened, he had seen it too. The air, once filled with harmless ghost stories, now crackled with a far more dangerous kind of tension, and the night had only just begun. The moment Iris Staverton smiled, the entire gathering shifted around her, as though caught in an unseen current. Lady Cynthia had been right. This was a dangerous woman, not in the way of the predictable siren, with flashing eyes and dark allure, but in something far subtler. Her delicate fairness, those unsettlingly deep blue eyes, the almost gaunt sharpness of her face in repose. She seemed made for shadows, for secrets whispered in candlelight. And then there was that smile, sudden, luminous, transforming. It could make you forget what you were thinking, what you were saying. It could make you forget yourself. Mr. Lennox observed her keenly, but not even he was immune to the subtle gravity she exerted over the group. She settled into the heart of their circle, as though she had always been there, as though she had always belonged, and perhaps she did. It was Major Henderson who broke Mr. Lennox from his thoughts. Shall we take a turn about the grounds? He suggested, and though Lennox was not one for idle strolls, he nodded. feeling an odd compulsion to stretch his legs. They moved across the manicured lawn, the manor behind them a looming silhouette against the dusky sky. "That was quite the story you told earlier," the Major remarked, his tone deceptively casual. Lennox merely smiled. "Come, I'll show you the window." He led the way to the west side of the house, where the air grew still, almost too quiet. The small enclosed garden, known as the privy garden, was hidden behind high holly hedges. Even the entrance was carefully designed, a narrow winding path that turned abruptly, as if to keep out more than just the wind. Inside, the garden was eerily serene, stone pathways lined with weathered flower beds, a low carved bench, and the overwhelming scent of something faintly metallic beneath the rich perfume of late-blooming roses. They reached the center, and Lennox lifted a hand, pointing upward. There, the west wing of Ravenscourt Manor was stark and unbroken, save for a single window, half choked by ivy, the glass dulled with years of dust and grime. Even from below it was clear. The panels inside were sealed, heavy boards pressed against the frame, locking whatever was inside away. Major Henderson squinted. "I see a stain on the glass, faint, almost like a—" He stopped, shaking his head. "A face," Lennox finished for him. "But from here it's barely noticeable." "You're too close." "There's a clearing higher in the woods where the effect is clearer." He turned, cutting sharply through the garden's exit, and into the dense trees beyond, his voice carrying through the twilight. "When they boarded this one up, they had to make a new window on the south wall, the one facing the lawn where we were sitting. That room belongs to the Darcys now. That's why I didn't want to speak too much of it earlier." Major Henderson said nothing for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then softly, "And do you think Mrs. Darcy knows?" Lennox smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I imagine she will soon enough." A branch cracked somewhere deeper in the woods. The night was watching, and it was only just beginning. Mr. Lennox cast a glance at Major Henderson, suddenly aware that the man hadn't heard a word of what he had been saying. His brow was furrowed, his grip tight on the walking stick he carried, and as he slashed at a cluster of foxgloves, he muttered under his breath, "She shouldn't have come. She never should have come." People often confided in Lennox this way, speaking as though he were nothing more than an invisible observer, a presence so unobtrusive that their thoughts simply spilled forth. It was a gift in a way. People spoke freely when they believed they weren't truly being heard. "No," Henderson repeated, as if convincing himself. "She never should have come." Lennox knew at once he wasn't speaking of Mrs. Darcy. "You think not?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Henderson gave a sharp shake of his head, his expression shadowed. "I was there, you know. The three of us, Scott, myself and Iris. She's a remarkable woman, brilliant, fearless, and dangerous." He hesitated, his mouth tightening. What made them invite her? Lennox shrugged. "Ignorance, perhaps." "There's going to be trouble," Henderson said grimly. "We'll have to do what we can." Lennox glanced at him sidelong. "Trouble? With Mrs. Staverton?" Henderson exhaled sharply. "I'm talking about Scott." He hesitated just long enough before adding, almost as an afterthought, "and his wife." Lennox had been considering her all along, though he didn't bother to point it out. It was clear that until now, Henderson had all but forgotten about her. "How did they meet?" Lennox asked. "Last winter, Cairo. It was quick, 3 weeks engaged, 6 weeks married." He sighed, shaking his head. "She's charming, no doubt, and he's mad about her, but that won't change a thing." And then once more, as if the words themselves had a terrible weight, "Damn it all, she shouldn't have come." They had climbed higher through the tangled brush, emerging onto a grassy rise that overlooked the west side of Ravenscourt Manor. The sky was bruised with the deepening hues of dusk, the last vestiges of light slipping behind the trees. With something of a showman's flair, Lennox raised a hand and gestured forward. "Look," he said simply, and there it was, the window. Even at this distance, the warped glass caught the fading light strangely, distorting shapes in a way that sent an involuntary shiver through the spine. At first it was just a shadowed blur, a trick of reflection, but then the dusk deepened, and the image sharpened, a face, motionless, watching, and above it, unmistakable against the grimy pane, the dark plume of a cavalier's hat. Henderson inhaled sharply, his fingers clenched around his walking stick. The air had grown deathly still. It was watching them, and whatever had been set in motion that evening had only just begun. "Strange," murmured Henderson, narrowing his eyes. "Really very strange. I wonder what would happen if that pane of glass were ever smashed." Lennox allowed himself a small knowing smile. "That, my dear fellow, is one of the most fascinating parts of the tale. That pane has been replaced at least 11 times, perhaps more. The last attempt was 12 years ago, when the owner of Ravenscourt Manor, a man of no patience for legends, decided to put an end to the nonsense. Yet, every time, the same thing happens. The stain reappears. Not immediately, of course. It creeps back, spreading slowly, a month or two, and then it's as if it had never been replaced at all." For the first time, Henderson shivered. A real shiver, the kind that ran deeper than the cold. "Damn peculiar," he muttered. "There's no accounting for things like this. But tell me, what's the real reason they boarded up that room?" Lennox's voice was casual, but his eyes held something sharp. A rather curious belief took hold that the room was unlucky. The Eveshams stayed there just before their scandalous divorce. Then Stanley and his wife occupied it, until he ran off with a chorus girl. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "So not a threat to life, a threat to fidelity." Lennox merely nodded, but his thoughts whispered otherwise. "And now the Scotts sleep there. I wonder." They walked back towards the house in silence, the soft grass muffling their steps. The weight of unspoken things hung between them, each lost in thought. It was then, as they rounded the holly hedge, that they heard voices raised, urgent, unmistakable. Iris Stiverton's voice rang out from the depths of the privy garden, sharp and laced with something dark. "You will regret this, regret it bitterly." A man's voice answered, "Scots," but his words were too low, too uncertain to be understood. Then Iris's voice rose again, cutting through the night with a chilling intensity. "Jealousy, jealousy is the devil. It can drive a person to madness, to murder. Richard, for God's sake, be careful." And then she appeared, striding out of the privy garden, oblivious to them, moving swiftly around the side of the house, not walking, almost running, like a woman possessed, fleeing from something unseen, something dreadful. Lennox felt a shift in the air, something intangible but undeniable. Lady Cynthia had been right. A dangerous woman. For the first time, he had a terrible premonition, a sense of something coming, something swift and final, a tragedy, inevitable, and waiting. And yet, that evening, as the house settled into its familiar rhythm of murmured conversations and clinking glasses, he almost felt foolish for his fears. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Stiverton, with her effortless charm, showed no sign of distress. Moira Scott was as graceful and warm as ever. The two women chatted with apparent ease. Nothing seemed amiss, nothing at all. And yet, something had already begun. The evening played out in a deceptive calm. Richard Scott, for all his brooding reputation, was in unexpectedly high spirits, laughing a little too loudly, drinking a little too quickly. His wife Moira remained poised, ever the perfect hostess, her smiles soft and unwavering. Across the room, Iris Stiverton sat, her presence commanding in a way that seemed effortless, drawing people in, without even trying. But beneath the polished veneer of civility, the house held its breath. The only one who seemed visibly unsettled was stout Mrs. Unkerton, her hands fidgeting with the folds of her dress, as she took Mr. Lennox aside. Her voice was low but urgent. "Think me a fool if you like, but there's something about that window that gives me the chills, and I'll tell you this, I've sent for a glazier. Ned doesn't know, and I don't care if he does." Lennox tilted his head. "A glazier, to replace that cursed pane of glass, of course," she said, glancing around as if the very walls were listening. "Ned might think it adds some grand, historical charm to the house, but I tell you, I won't sleep easy until it's gone. A fresh, clean, modern pane, that's what we need. No stories, no stains creeping back like bad omens." Lennox studied her thoughtfully. "You do realize," he said at last, "that the stain always comes back." Mrs. Unkerton's lips pressed into a thin, defiant line. "Then it's against nature," she said sharply. "And if it does reappear, well, we aren't so poor that we can't afford a new pane every week if necessary." Lennox said nothing. He had seen too many things crumble in the face of money to believe in invincible ghosts, and yet, Mrs. Unkerton, with all her practical good sense, was visibly uneasy. She might dismiss the legend as nonsense, but even she felt the tension in the air. She merely chose to blame it on old superstitions rather than the very real undercurrents swirling among her guests, and Lennox wasn't the only one picking up on those tensions. As he ascended the grand staircase later that night, he overheard voices from an alcove below. John Henderson and Iris Stuyvesant sat close together, their conversation low but urgent. "I had no idea the Scotts were going to be here," Iris was saying, her golden voice touched with irritation. "If I had known, perhaps I wouldn't have come. But now that I'm here, John, I assure you, I have no intention of running away." Lennox continued his ascent, leaving them behind, his mind churning. Was that the truth? Did she truly not know, or had she come for precisely this reason? As he reached his room, he shook his head. Perhaps in the clarity of morning, all of this would seem like nothing, merely an overactive imagination twisting shadows into something darker than they were. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that something had already begun, that fate had already turned its wheels, and that someone, before the night was over, would regret ever setting foot in Ravenscourt Manor. Mr. Lennox assured himself it was merely a trick of the nerves, nothing more. Yes, last night had felt tense, almost unbearable, but morning had brought clarity. People adjusted, they swallowed their emotions, they moved on. That was the way of the world. No grand catastrophe loomed over them. His unease had been a symptom of fatigue, or perhaps indigestion, liver, most likely. He was due for a visit to Carlsbad, in a fortnight anyway. Determined to shake off the last remnants of his foolish anxiety, he suggested to Major Henderson that they take a stroll before dusk, a simple walk, nothing more, a bit of fresh air, a bit of exercise. He muttered to himself, that's what he needed. The woods were eerily quiet as they made their way through, the sky above melting into the deep purples and reds of twilight. Henderson was uncharacteristically silent, his face grim. "I can't help but feel," Lennox ventured, "that we may have been rather foolish in our imaginings yesterday, expecting, well, trouble, but after all, people are civilized, they suppress their emotions, they behave themselves." "Perhaps," Henderson muttered, a pause, then almost reluctantly, he added, "civilized people." Lennox frowned. "You mean, people who've spent too much time outside civilization sometimes forget the rules?" There was something unnerving in his tone. They reached the crest of the hill, stepping onto the clearing where the house loomed ahead. Lennox exhaled sharply, winded from the incline. He turned his gaze toward the infamous window, and his breath caught in his throat. The face was still there, pressed against the glass, more vivid than before. "So our hostess changed her mind," he murmured. Henderson barely glanced at the window. Unkerton must have put his foot down. He's the sort of man who likes to boast about owning a house with a good ghost story. He wouldn't let something as trivial as a new pane of glass spoil that. But even as he spoke, Henderson's gaze wasn't on the house, it was fixed on the dense undergrowth around them, his body rigid. "Has it ever struck you," he said suddenly, "that civilization is a dangerous thing?" Lennox blinked. "Dangerous, my dear fellow, whatever do you mean?" "There are no safety valves," Henderson muttered, almost to himself. "No way to let out the pressure. People pretend they're in control, but when it builds too much it explodes." Lennox swallowed. "You're speaking in riddles, Henderson." The other man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "There are some people who can sense a storm before it breaks," he said, "and others who can feel when trouble is coming. There's trouble coming now, Lennox. Big trouble. It could come any minute. It could." A sound interrupted him, a sharp, brittle crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. Both men froze. The woods were silent again, but the air had changed, thick, stifling, and then somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable sound of a woman's scream tore through the dusk. Porter stopped abruptly, his hand clamping down on Lennox's arm like a vice. The world around them held its breath. Then it came, a sharp, unmistakable crack, a shot, no, 2 shots. A heartbeat later, the cry of a woman rang out through the suffocating silence of the twilight, a cry of terror, of agony. "My God," Porter breathed, his face usually unreadable, had transformed, set in grim certainty. "It's come," and he was off. tearing down the path with terrifying urgency, his long strides devouring the distance. Lennox, though winded, followed, his mind a chaos of dread and confusion. They burst onto the lawn, coming to a halt by the hedge of the privy garden. At the very same moment, from the opposite side of the house, two figures emerged, Richard Scott and Mr. Unkerton. They stopped in their tracks, catching sight of one another, their gazes locking. "It came from in there," Unkerton stammered, his face ghostly pale, his flabby hand trembling as he pointed toward the enclosed garden. "We have to see," Porter commanded. Without hesitation, he pushed forward. They rounded the final bend in the holly hedge, and Porter stopped so suddenly that Lennox nearly crashed into him. His breath hitched in his throat as he peered over Porter's shoulder. A strangled cry erupted from Richard Scott. There, sprawled on the soft grass near the weathered stone seat, were two figures, a man, a woman, motionless, their bodies eerily still in the fading light, and standing above them, rigid, eyes wide with shock, was Mrs. Staverton. She was staring down at the bodies, her expression a mask of horror. In her right hand, gripped loosely, as though she barely understood she was holding it, was a gun. "Iris," Porter's voice was sharp, urgent. He stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Iris, for God's sake, what's that in your hand?" Her eyes dropped slowly, dazedly to her fingers. The object resting there seemed foreign to her, as if she had only just realized it existed. "It's a pistol," she murmured, wonderingly. Then, after a long, unbearable silence, though in reality it had only been seconds, she added in a distant, hollow voice, "I picked it up." Lennox barely noticed her words. His gaze had locked onto Unkerton and Scott, who had rushed forward to kneel beside the fallen figures. "A doctor," Scott whispered. "We must get a doctor." His voice, though controlled, held a note of quiet desperation, but Lennox knew, even before Richard Scott confirmed it, there was no need for a doctor. Jimmy Allinson lay sprawled, his once vibrant face now frozen in an expression of startled shock, his body unnaturally still, and beside him, Moira Scott, the woman who had once been full of life and energy, was now nothing more than a silent form, her golden hair fanned out like a halo around her, lifeless. Richard Scott moved with controlled precision. He had not spoken another word since his first anguished exclamation, but his iron composure had taken hold. Gently, reverently, he placed his wife's body back onto the ground. "She was shot from behind," he said quietly, his voice tight, restrained. "The bullet passed clean through." Then, turning his attention to Jimmy Allinson, he carefully examined the wound. The entry was in the chest. The bullet had lodged inside. John Porter took a step forward, his tone firm. "Nothing must be disturbed," he said, steel in his voice. "The police need to see it exactly as it is." "The police," Richard Scott repeated, and then something changed. His eyes lifted, and a flicker of something raw and dangerous ignited within them. His gaze swung sharply to Mrs. Staverton. The pistol was still clutched in her hand. For the first time, true rage, true grief, twisted across his face. He took a step toward her, a single step, his entire body coiled like a predator ready to strike. But John Porter moved just as swiftly, positioning himself in Scott's path. For a moment there was nothing but silence, a stillness thick with unspoken words, a duel of eyes, a silent warning. Then, so subtly that it might have gone unnoticed, Porter shook his head, a warning, a command, and for now Richard Scott obeyed, but the storm had not passed, it had only begun. "No, Richard," Porter said, his voice steady, unyielding. "It looks like it, but you're wrong." Richard Scott stood frozen, his breath shallow, his lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual command. "Then why?" He hesitated, his eyes locked onto the woman standing just beyond the bodies. "Why is she holding that?" His gaze bore into Iris Staverton, searching for an answer, an explanation, something that could make sense of this nightmare. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then in that same strange detached voice, as if she were merely an observer to her own fate, she murmured, "I picked it up." Silence, heavy and suffocating. Then Unkerton, his voice quivering slightly, pushed himself to his feet. "The police," he said, as if reminding himself of the next logical step. "We must send for the police at once." He turned to Scott. "You will telephone, perhaps?" Scott didn't answer. His jaw was clenched, his hands curled into fists, his eyes dark with grief, and something colder, something dangerous remained fixed on Iris. Uncertain shifted uncomfortably. "Someone should stay here," he added hastily. Yes, I'm sure someone should stay." It was Mr. Satterthwaite, ever the composed gentleman, who stepped forward with quiet authority. "I will stay," he offered. Uncertain exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Yes, good. Thank you, my dear fellow. I must," he hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. "I must break the news to the ladies. Lady Cynthia, my wife." His voice trailed off as he turned and walked away, his shoulders sagging with the weight of what he had to do. And so Mr. Satterthwaite remained. The Privy Garden, which had once been a place of quiet, secretive beauty, was now a scene of tragedy. The scent of crushed grass, and the faint lingering trace of gunpowder hung in the cool night air. He stood motionless, looking down at the lifeless form of Moira Scott. "Poor child," he murmured under his breath. "Poor child." His mind wandered, grasping for meaning, for a reason behind the senseless violence. He found himself recalling a phrase, something about how the evil men do lives after them. Wasn't that true now? Richard Scott had not fired the shot that killed his wife, but had he not, in some way set these events into motion? And what of Iris Staverton? They would hang her, he was certain of that. The pistol in her hand, the circumstances, what other explanation would the police need? He shuddered. And yet, something didn't sit right. His keen eyes traced Moira's delicate features. Even in death there was a haunting beauty about her. The soft curls of golden hair, the faint trace of a smile lingering on her lips, as though she had slipped away mid-thought, mid-dream. Then something caught his attention, a small drop of blood, not on the ground, not on her dress, but on the lobe of her ear. Satterthwaite's mind ticked like a clockwork mechanism. Blood? On her ear? He craned his neck forward, peering closer. An earring was missing. The discovery sent a strange shiver through him. A single pearl drop earring still adorned her left ear, but the right one was gone, torn away perhaps, in the fall, or, before. His thoughts whirled, and then a voice behind him. "And now, sir," Mr. Satterthwaite turned sharply. The library, the heavy scent of cigar smoke and old books lingered in the dimly lit room. Inspector Winkfield stood before him, a man of 40-odd years with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had been thorough in his questioning, methodical in his observations, and now, it seemed, he had reached a conclusion. "As I understand it, gentlemen," the inspector began, his voice measured, "you had been on a walk, returning to the house by a path that winds around the left side of what they call the Privy Garden. Is that correct?" Porter nodded. "Correct, Inspector. You heard 2 shots, Winkfield continued, followed by a woman's scream. "Yes, you then ran as fast as you could toward the scene. Upon arrival, you saw no one leave." Porter hesitated for the briefest of moments. No one could have left without being seen." Inspector Winkfield folded his arms. "And the entrance? There is only one way in or out of the garden, is there not?" "Yes," Porter confirmed. Winkfield's gaze flickered toward Uncertain, who sat slumped in an armchair, staring blankly at the opposite wall. "If anyone had fled," the inspector continued, "they could have only gone 2 ways. To the right, where they would have run straight into Mr. Uncertain and Mr. Scott, or to the left." He let the words hang in the air. Mr. Satterthwaite felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. Something was wrong, something didn't fit. A locked room mystery, in the open air, a woman dead, another, holding the gun. And yet, Mr. Satterthwaite's gaze drifted to the inspector's notes, the meticulous recording of statements, observations, and evidence, and among them, a single pearl drop earring, found not on Moira Scott's body, but clutched tightly in the dead hand of Jimmy Allinson. A chill ran down Mr. Satterthwaite's spine. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, and it was nothing like what they had all assumed. "That is so," Major Porter confirmed. Though his face had gone deathly pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, trembled almost imperceptibly. Inspector Winkfield gave a short nod, his keen eyes scanning the faces before him. "That," he said evenly, "seems to settle it." A heavy silence fell over the room. The weight of finality in the inspector's words was unbearable. He continued, his voice measured and deliberate. At 6:10, Mrs. Staverton was seen leaving the house. She spoke briefly to Mr. and Mrs. Unkerton and Lady Cynthia Drudge, who were seated on the lawn. Mr. Scott was in the billiard room, which overlooks that very lawn. 2 minutes later the shots were heard. His gaze flicked to Richard Scott, who had not spoken a word since the interrogation began. In response, Mr. Scott rushed out, meeting Mr. Unkerton, and both men ran immediately to the privy garden. Simultaneously, Major Porter, along with Mr. Satterthwaite, arrived from the opposite direction. Winkfield paused, his words hanging in the air like a noose tightening around an unseen culprit. Mrs. Staverton was in the garden, he continued, holding a pistol from which 2 shots had been fired. No one moved, no one breathed. The sequence seems clear. She shot Mrs. Scott first, a sharp intake of breath from Richard Scott, but he said nothing. From behind while she sat on the bench. Then Captain Ullinson sprang up, possibly in an attempt to disarm her, and she fired again. The bullet struck him in the chest. His voice dropped lower. Captain Ullinson did not survive. Still silence. The inspector's next words came softer, but no less dangerous. "I understand that there was a previous attachment between Mrs. Staverton and Mr. Richard Scott." The implication sliced through the air like a blade. "That's a damned lie." Porter's voice rang out, raw and defiant. His face was no longer pale but flushed with anger, his body rigid with tension, his knuckles white as bone, flexed against the armrest of his chair. Inspector Winkfield merely tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He had expected the outburst. He said nothing, merely letting the words settle. Mr. Satterthwaite, who had thus far remained silent, finally spoke. His voice was quieter, but no less intent. "What does she say?" Winkfield turned his gaze toward him, measuring. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk between them. "She says," he began slowly, "that she went into the privy garden to be alone for a moment. She had no intention of meeting anyone there." Another pause. The inspector's eyes swept across the room, absorbing every reaction, every flicker of doubt or certainty. "She claims that just before she rounded the last hedge, she heard the shots." A murmur rippled through the group. "When she turned the corner," the inspector continued, his voice unwavering, "she saw the bodies. The pistol lay at her feet. She picked it up." His words were deliberate now, each syllable weighted. "She insists, absolutely insists, that she saw no one else in the garden." Another silence, a charged one. "And yet," Winkfield murmured, "although I cautioned her, she insisted on making a statement. There was something almost dangerous in that. A woman so certain, so unwavering, despite all evidence stacked against her." Porter's breathing was unsteady. Then suddenly, he turned toward Mr. Satterthwaite, with a sharp movement, as if some last desperate hope had seized him. "You," he said urgently, "can't you help? Can't you do something?" Mr. Satterthwaite blinked. For a moment he was taken aback. Him, the most insignificant of men, called upon, appealed to by John Porter of all people. There was something strangely exhilarating in it. And yet, before he could respond, a quiet cough broke the moment. The butler, Thompson, had entered the room. He held out a silver tray, upon which sat a single calling card. A faintly apologetic look crossed his face as he handed it to his master. Unkerton took the card without a word, his hand slightly unsteady. His eyes flicked over the name inscribed there, and then his expression changed. His already pale complexion turned a shade whiter. For a moment, just a moment, his lips parted, as though to speak. Then, without a word, he laid the card down on the table. The name gleamed under the dim library light, and suddenly, everything changed. Mr. Unkerton remained slumped in his chair, his broad frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the night's horrors. He had not spoken, nor moved, since the inspector's last remarks, his glassy eyes fixed on the far wall, seeing perhaps nothing at all. Thompson hesitated before clearing his throat. "I told the gentleman you would likely not be able to receive him, sir," he said, his voice careful, but he was most insistent. "He claims he had an appointment, and that the matter is urgent." Uncurtain barely stirred, his hand moving sluggishly toward the card offered to him. His bloodshot eyes scanned the name. "Mr. Harley Quinn," he muttered. "I remember now, he was to see me about a picture. I did arrange an appointment, but under the circumstances," he made a vague helpless gesture, but before he could refuse, Mr. Satterthwaite sprang forward, his usually mild features alive with an unexpected fervor. "Mr. Harley Quinn, did you say?" he cried, his voice sharp with surprise. He turned swiftly toward Major Porter. "You asked if I could help you. I believe I can." There was something electric in the air now, a sudden shift, as though the very atmosphere had thickened. Satterthwaite turned back to Uncurtain, his small frame stiff with urgency. "This Mr. Quinn is no ordinary man. He is a friend, or rather an acquaintance of mine, and he possesses a most remarkable gift." The inspector, who had been listening with an air of restrained impatience, let out a short, skeptical snort. "One of these armchair detectives, is he?" he asked, his voice edged with thinly veiled derision. "No," said Satterthwaite firmly, "he is not that sort of man at all. He does not investigate, nor does he deduce." His eyes gleamed. "But he has a power, an uncanny power. He does not uncover new facts, but instead makes you see what you have already seen, hear what you have already heard, only this time clearly." A silence followed his words, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. Uncurtain glanced at the inspector. Wingfield merely gave another irritated sigh, and looked toward the ceiling, as though he wished to detach himself from this nonsense. A brief moment passed, then Uncurtain gave a short nod. Thompson bowed slightly, and slipped from the room. A hush settled over the assembled men. Then the door opened again, and a tall, slim figure stepped inside. Mr. Harley Quinn. He was dressed in a long coat, patterned in subtle checks, and beneath the warm glow of the red-shaded lamp, the colors of the fabric seemed to shift, deepening, darkening, as though absorbing the very atmosphere of the room. But his face remained in shadow, the angles indistinct, his features unreadable, almost masked. "Mr. Uncurtain." His voice was smooth, yet with a curious cadence, an undertone that one could not quite place. He extended a hand briefly. "I apologize for intruding at such a time. It appears we must postpone our conversation about your painting for another occasion." His head tilted slightly. "Ah, Mr. Satterthwaite." A small smile touched his lips. Still as devoted to the drama as ever, something in the way he spoke the words made Satterthwaite's heart quicken. He did not answer immediately, only nodding, his throat suddenly dry. Mr. Quinn took a seat. The crimson glow of the lamp painted strange patterns over his coat, but left his eyes hidden. The effect was unsettling. Satterthwaite straightened himself. "Mr. Quinn," he said, his voice taking on a gravity it rarely had. "We have a drama unfolding before us, a dark one, and we are in the very heart of it." His eyes flicked toward Major Porter. "We would very much like to have your perspective." Quinn said nothing at first. He merely inclined his head slightly, as though absorbing the weight of the room, the story within its walls, and then slowly, he smiled. A smile that was neither reassuring nor unkind, a smile that simply was. He folded his hands together. Then he said, in a voice that was impossibly gentle, "Tell me the tale." And the room, heavy with expectation, waited. The room was deathly silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Mr. Quinn, breathlessly awaiting the words of the oracle. But he merely shook his head, his face remaining in the half-shadow cast by the dim lamplight. "A sad story," he said at last, his voice almost a whisper. "A very sad and shocking tragedy. The lack of motive makes it particularly intriguing." Uncurtain, who had been leaning forward in expectation, sat back sharply, his brows knitting together. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taut. "Mrs. Staverton was heard to threaten Richard Scott. She was bitterly jealous of his wife." "Jealousy, I agree," said Mr. Quinn, his tone light yet curiously final. "Jealousy, or demoniac possession, it amounts to the same thing. But you misunderstand me." A pause. Then his next words cut through the air like a knife. I was not referring to the murder of Mrs. Scott, but to that of Captain Allinson. For a moment no one spoke. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, the sound impossibly loud. Then you're right, Porter suddenly burst out, his voice breaking the tension like the snap of a whip. He turned, his expression fierce, his hands clenched as though he had grasped onto something tangible at last. There's a flaw there. If Iris had ever contemplated killing Mrs. Scott, she'd have done it somewhere private, somewhere she wouldn't be caught. No, we're on the wrong track, and I think, his eyes glinted with a feverish light, I think I see another solution. His words hung in the air, anticipation thickening like storm clouds before the break of thunder. Only 3 people went into the Privy Garden. That much is indisputable, and I don't intend to dispute it. But suppose, his voice lowered slightly, almost as if afraid to give shape to the thought, suppose Jimmy Allinson shot Mrs. Scott, and then himself. The silence that followed was different this time, not breathless expectation, but something else. Skepticism. Porter pressed on. It's possible, isn't it? He fires at Mrs. Scott then in some fit of madness, turns the gun on himself, the pistol falls from his grip. Mrs. Starverton finds it on the ground and picks it up, just as she said. How's that? The inspector was already shaking his head before Porter had finished speaking. Won't wash, Major Porter. His voice was steady, immovable. If Captain Allinson had fired that shot at himself, the cloth of his jacket would have been singed, gunpowder residue would have marked the entry wound. Porter opened his mouth, but the inspector was quicker. He might have held the pistol at arm's length, you'll say. His expression hardened. But why should he? No sense in it. And besides, there's no motive. A shadow flickered over Porter's face. He glanced away, his jaw tightening. Might have gone off his head suddenly, he muttered. But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. The theory was slipping through his fingers like sand. A tense silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. And then, as if suddenly remembering, Porter turned sharply toward Mr. Quinn. Well, he demanded, what do you say? Mr. Quinn regarded him for a long moment. Then quietly he shook his head. I am not a magician, he said. I am not even a criminologist, but I will tell you one thing. I believe in the power of impressions. His gaze swept over the room, pausing on each face, searching. In any moment of crisis, there is always one instant that stands apart, one image that burns itself into the mind when all else fades, a moment that remains. His voice softened, becoming almost hypnotic. Mr. Satterthwaite, you are, I think, the most unprejudiced observer among us. Will you cast your mind back? Forget logic. Forget preconceived ideas. Forget what you believe to be true. Instead, his eyes darkened. Tell us the moment that made the strongest impression upon you. Was it when you heard the shots? When you saw the bodies? When you observed the pistol in Mrs. Starverton's hand? The air was thick, charged with something unseen. Mr. Satterthwaite swallowed. Clear your mind, Mr. Quinn continued, and tell us. For a moment Satterthwaite felt as though he were caught in a dream. He was staring at Mr. Quinn, but it was as if he were looking through him, beyond him, into the depths of his own memory. He searched, sifting through the images of the evening, until he saw it. No, he said at last, his voice oddly distant. It was not any of those. The words were out before he even knew he was speaking them. A hush fell. The moment I shall always remember, he continued slowly, his breath catching, was when I stood alone by the bodies, afterwards, looking down at Mrs. Scott. His hands felt cold. He licked his lips. She was lying on her side. Her hair was ruffled. A pause, and there was a spot of blood on her little ear. The words hung in the air, pulsing with some unseen significance. A slow, creeping realization shivered through him, and in that instant, he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong, and from the shadows Mr. Quinn only watched. Blood on her ear. Unkerton's voice was slow, almost dazed, as though he were turning the words over in his mind, struggling to make sense of them. Yes, I remember. It must have been from her earring, Mr. Satterthwaite offered, though even as he said it, the words felt oddly hollow, uncertain. It must have been torn out when she fell. There was a pause, a heavy, unnatural silence. It didn't quite sound right. She was lying on her left side, Major Porter said suddenly, his sharp mind seizing on the detail. His gaze flicked between them, searching. I suppose it was that ear. No, Mr. Satterthwaite said quickly, too quickly. The realization had hit him the moment he heard the question. It was her right ear. The words left a strange hush in their wake. A kind of unspoken dread settled over them, like mist creeping through a graveyard at dawn. The inspector coughed, reaching into his pocket. I found this in the grass. He held up a small delicate loop of gold wire. There was a moment of stillness. Then, my God, man, Porter burst out. His voice was raw, incredulous. That can't have been wrenched to pieces by a mere fall. Look at it. It's broken clean. As if. He stopped, breath catching in his throat, as if it were shot away. A ripple of unease ran through the room, invisible yet undeniable. Yes, Mr. Satterthwaite murmured, something clicking into place in his mind, cold and final. Yes, a bullet. It must have been a bullet, but the inspector frowned, shaking his head. There were only 2 shots. His voice was even logical, but something uncertain had entered his eyes. One shot can't have grazed her ear, and then struck her in the back as well. And if one bullet carried away the earring, and the second shot killed her. He trailed off, brow furrowed. His thoughts were aligning, taking him towards something unsettling. Then it can't have killed Captain Allinson as well, he finished slowly. Not unless he stopped again. His breath hitched. A dreadful understanding was forming in his mind. Not unless he was standing right in front of her, very close, facing her, as though. His voice broke, and then Mr. Quinn spoke, his voice calm, almost amused. Unless she was in his arms. The words cut through the air like a blade. Everyone stared at each other, at Mr. Quinn, at the impossibility of what had just been said. The idea was so strange, so unexpected, that it left them momentarily stunned. Captain Allinson and Mrs. Scott. It made no sense. And yet, they barely knew each other, Unkerton murmured. His words had the air of someone grasping at the last shreds of certainty, refusing to let go. But Mr. Satterthwaite was no longer so sure. Did they? He asked thoughtfully. He was speaking more to himself now, following the thread of something unseen. They might have known each other better than we thought. Lady Cynthia mentioned he saved her from boredom in Egypt last winter. And you, he turned to Porter, his voice sharpening. You told me that Richard Scott met his wife in Cairo that same winter. It's possible, very possible, that they knew each other well indeed. Silence. Then Unkerton muttered, almost defensively, they didn't seem to be together much. No, Satterthwaite agreed. They avoided each other, but now that I think of it, it was almost unnatural. The realization settled upon them like a shadow falling across the room. Slowly each of them turned their gaze to Mr. Quinn. He smiled, but it was a strange knowing smile. You see, he said softly, what Mr. Satterthwaite's impression has done for us. Then he turned to Unkerton. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were searching. And now, Mr. Unkerton, it is your turn. Unkerton blinked. I don't understand. When I entered this room, Quinn continued, you were deep in thought. I would like to know exactly what thought was on your mind. Don't dismiss it. It doesn't matter if it seems irrelevant. It doesn't even matter if it seems superstitious. There was a flicker in Unkerton's eyes, a subtle involuntary reaction, a tightening of his fingers. Mr. Quinn saw it. Tell us. Unkerton hesitated. Then almost reluctantly, he spoke. I don't mind telling you, he said gruffly, though it's got nothing to do with the business, and you'll probably laugh at me for saying it. Nobody laughed. Nobody even moved. I was thinking, Unkerton went on slowly, his voice lower now, that my wife should have left well alone, that she shouldn't have replaced that pane of glass in the haunted window. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I have the strangest feeling, as if by doing that she's brought a curse upon us. The words settled over the room like frost. No one spoke. No one moved. Unkerton frowned, suddenly uncomfortable. Why are you looking at me like that? He asked, his voice slightly sharper. It was just a thought, a silly one. Mr. Satterthwaite inhaled sharply, his hands clenched at his sides. But she hasn't replaced it yet, he said, and the room, already heavy with unease, seemed to grow even colder. Yes, she has, Unkerton murmured, his voice suddenly hollow. The man came first thing this morning. A strange heavy silence filled the room. Porter exhaled sharply. My God, he said, his face pale with realization. "I think I understand now." His gaze snapped to Uncertain. "That room, it's paneled, isn't it? Not papered." "Yes, but what does that?" Porter didn't wait for the rest. He was already moving, striding purposefully out of the room, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The others followed instinctively, drawn by the sudden urgency in his manner. He took the stairs 2 at a time, heading straight for the Scots bedroom. The air in the room felt still, too still, as though it had been holding its breath. It was an elegant space, paneled in soft cream, with 2 large windows, gazing southward, but Porter wasn't interested in the windows. He turned sharply to the western wall, running his hands along the smooth surface, fingers pressing, searching. "There's a spring here somewhere," he muttered, half to himself. "There has to be. It wouldn't just be a legend, not if." A soft click, a breathless moment of stillness. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, a section of the paneling slid back. Behind it, hidden from the world for years, was the haunted window. The glass was grimy, untouched by time, except for one pane, which gleamed new and clear, the pane that had been replaced. Porter inhaled sharply and bent down, his sharp eyes catching something on the floor. He reached for it and straightened, his hand opening to reveal a delicate fragment, a wisp of ostrich feather. Silence. Then slowly, Porter turned his head toward Mr. Quinn. Their eyes met, and Quinn nodded. Moving with quiet precision, Quinn crossed the room to the wardrobe. He pulled open the door, running his fingers along the array of hats inside. Then carefully, he withdrew one. A wide-brimmed hat, elegant and elaborate, adorned with curling black feathers, a hat meant for a woman, an ascot hat. He held it up, and his voice when he finally spoke was soft, almost reflective. "Let us imagine," Mr. Quinn murmured, "a man one consumed by jealousy. A man who had once stayed here, years ago, and who, for reasons of his own, knew the secret hidden within these walls." The room felt colder somehow, as though a ghost had stirred in its long-forgotten slumber. One evening, on impulse, he presses the hidden spring, revealing the old, dirty glass. He has no real reason to do so, perhaps only curiosity, or some restless need to peer into the past, and then he sees something. Quinn turned the hat in his hands, his gaze distant, lost in the story he was weaving. Outside in the privy garden, 2 figures stand close, closer than they should be, secure in the belief that they are unseen. His wife and another man. His voice darkened, and in that moment, there is no doubt in his mind, no question. He sees everything, feels everything, rage, humiliation, betrayal. A madness grips him, something primal, something beyond reason. But he is clever. He does not storm outside in fury. No, he thinks. A hush settled over them, thick and heavy. He remembers the legend of the haunted window. He remembers the watching cavalier, and an idea comes to him. Quinn lifted the hat slightly, letting the light catch the curling feathers. He takes this, the perfect disguise. In the growing dusk, it is all anyone would see, a shadowed figure, a dark silhouette behind the old stained glass, a ghost, a sharp breath. Someone swallowed, and so he waits. Quinn continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, waits until the 2 below embrace, until their bodies are pressed close. He lifts his gun, and he fires. Silence. "He's an excellent shot," Quinn said softly. The first bullet strikes true, they collapse, and then, almost as an afterthought, he fires once more, a second shot. This one does not strike the body. This one, Quinn's eyes flick down to the feather in Porter's hand, catches an earring, tearing it away. He paused, as if letting the weight of his words settle into their bones. Then it is done. He drops the gun from the window, down into the privy garden below. He closes the panel, and he rushes downstairs, into the billiard room, into the chaos, already the grieving husband, already the innocent man. A shudder ran through the room. The pieces fit too perfectly. Porter took a sudden step forward, his voice ragged with disbelief. But he let her be accused. He choked out. He let her take the blame. He stood there and let them suspect her. Why would he do that? Quinn turned to face him fully. "I think," he said quietly, "I know why." He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before continuing. It is only a guess, but I believe Richard Scott was once madly in love with Iris Staverton. The name hit the air like a spark. So madly, Quinn went on, that even seeing her again, years later, reawakened something in him, something dangerous. The words felt heavy, like stones dropping into deep dark water. I think, Quinn continued, that Iris once believed she might love him too, that once long ago, she traveled with him, perhaps a hunting trip, perhaps something else, and I think, she came back in love with the better man. Porter stared at him, his breath unsteady. The better man, he murmured. His voice was hoarse, dazed. You mean? Quinn gave a small knowing smile. Yes, he said, I mean you. A beat of silence. Porter stood very still, his hands clenched, then released. Something flickered across his face. Understanding, regret, something deeper. Quinn's voice was gentle now. If I were you, I would go to her. For a long moment, Porter didn't move. Then with a sharp nod, he turned. He left the room without another word. The silence that followed was absolute, and the haunted window, its new glass gleaming in the dim light, stood witness to it all.